In Romans chapter 12, Paul says we are to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice to God. Welcome to your daily 180 Bible study. We've been talking about what that living sacrifice looks like. How does that living sacrifice live? We've seen it's very different from the dead sacrifices of the Old Testament, but what does it look like? Well, in chapter 14, we get a little bit more of a picture of what this sacrifice looks like that we give to God. For one thing, we notice that in chapter 14, this living sacrifice lives for the Lord and for no one else. In verses 1 through 9, we see that we need to surrender some things that we may hold dear. There are some things that we may believe very strongly, but they're not necessarily taught in the Word of God. It may be something I hold a very strong personal opinion about, but God doesn't lay it out in Scriptures. I can choose to be contentious about that and decide that everybody should share my opinion about all of these things, even if they're not taught in the Word of God. But instead of living and holding on to those contentions, what we need to do is surrender them. Lay them down on the altar as a part of my living sacrifice to God. But it doesn't mean that I have to give up my convictions. If there's something I believe very strongly about, I can continue to believe very strongly about it, but not force it on others when it's not taught explicitly in the Word of God. I also will give up my judgment of others. This is a difficult thing to do. But in verses 10 through 13, this is what Paul is telling us about. He says in verse 12, everyone will give account of himself to God. Remember, we're all going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. God is going to take care of the process of judging, and that's not something I need to concern myself with. Yes, I need to help my brother who is in sin, but I also need to recognize God as the one who will judge in all things. In verses 14 to 23, he gets very personal, and he talks to us about our personal liberties, things that we may have a right to do. It's not sinful for me to engage in an activity, but it may offend someone else to the point that they might lose their soul. They might be so disenchanted when they see me engaging in something they think is sinful that they will go off and they will walk away from Christ. And Paul says, don't do that. If eating meat offends my Jewish brother, guess what? I won't eat any meat as long as the world stands. I'm willing to give up my liberties if that's what it takes. I'm willing to lay that down upon the altar as a part of my living sacrifice to God. It isn't easy to be a sacrifice to the Lord, but this is what He requires of us. Are you willing to lay down your life as a sacrifice to God?